Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're tackling one of theology's greatest, most mind-bending paradoxes.
Oh, yeah. Which one?
How can God be utterly one and beyond all complexity, yet be the source of all the diverse, intricate things we know, and even be understood as three distinct persons in Christianity?
Okay. That's a big one.
We're diving into the doctrine of divine simplicity. It's a concept that fundamentally forces us to rethink what God even means.
Indeed. We're opening up a comprehensive theological report on divine simplicity. You could say it's a core tenet of classical Christian theology. It paints a vision of God that's radically distinct from all created reality.
Radically distinct.
Think of it as a set of tightly woven metaphysical propositions. They define the very ontological structure of the God of classical theism.
Okay, so our mission today is to unpack this profound doctrine. We'll explore its sweeping implications, trace its surprisingly deep historical roots, and dive into the intense debates that surround it even today. We'll be extracting the most important nuggets of knowledge to help you quickly grasp this complex idea and see why it matters so much.
Exactly. We'll explore why classical theologians believed God must be simple, what that truly means. It's far beyond just without parts.
Right.
We'll see how it grounds some of God's most essential attributes and how it really shapes our understanding of that fundamental creator-creature distinction.
Okay, let's do it. Let's unschool this fascinating thread.
Oh,
What is divine simplicity? Defining the simple God. All right, let's start at the very beginning. When classical theology states God is simple, we're not saying he's like unsophisticated or basic, are we?
no, definitely not. It's actually a negative doctrine.
Okay, a denial.
It's denying something. Specifically, it's denying any and all composition in God.
Opposition.
And this goes far beyond just saying God doesn't have physical body parts. I mean, God is incorporeal, a spirit, right?
Right.
Much more profoundly, it denies metaphysical composition.
Okay, what does that mean, metaphysical composition?
Think about anything you know. A house is made of bricks and wood. A human, traditionally, body and soul. Even an abstract idea might be made up of different concepts. God, in this view, has none of that internal structure. He isn't a combination of his wisdom and his power. He is them, perfectly united.
Ah, I see.
And crucially, it denies any distinction between God's essence, what he is, and his existence that he is.
So composition isn't just about physical pieces, but any internal division, structure, or combination whatsoever at any level of being.
That's the key takeaway. For these classical theologians, a composite being is inherently dependent.
Dependent, how so?
Think about it. A human depends on having both a body and a soul to be what it is. A statue depends on the bronze and the shape given to it.
Right.
Even an angel, though immaterial, is seen as a composite of its essence, what it is and its existence, that it is. All created things are composite.
Okay.
And this makes them dependent on their parts for their very being, and also dependent on an external cause to unite those parts into a coherent whole.
And since God is considered the absolute first cause, the ultimate reality from which everything else flows, he can't possibly be dependent in this way.
Exactly.
If he had parts, those parts would logically have to be prior to him, making him dependent on them.
Right.
And then he would need some kind of composer to put those parts together, which completely contradicts his ultimate status as the uncaused cause.
Precisely. And what's particularly striking here is that simplicity isn't seen as a deficiency, a lack of richness.
Interesting.
It's presented as the ultimate positive perfection. It's an index of God ontological superiority.
So simple isn't the opposite of complex here.
Not in the way we usually use it. The proper antonym for simple in this theological context isn't complex, but composite.
Gotcha.
Composite.
It asserts that all of God's perfections, his goodness, his power, his wisdom, they exist in a mode of absolute unity and identity. It is fundamentally different from our own composite existence. He isn't a collection of attributes, but a unified, perfect whole, the identity thesis. God is what he has. Okay, this denial of composition leads directly to what's called the identity thesis. And this is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit mind-bending for our everyday understanding.
Yeah, it definitely challenges our normal ways of thinking.
It posits profound identities within the divine being. How does that start to unfold?
Okay. First, and maybe most fundamentally, it says God's essence is identical to his existence.
Essence identical to existence.
Yeah. For us, for any created thing, we can conceive of a unicorn's essence, what it is, without it actually existing.
Okay.
Or we can imagine a specific person's nature, even if that person were to tragically cease to exist. Our existence is something received by our essence. It's not inherent to what we are.
Right, it's contingent.
Exactly. But for God, if his essence were distinct from his existence would have to be caused by something external, or he'd be a composite of essence and existence requiring an outside unifier.
So he'd be dependent again, just like any created thing, which can't be true if he's the first cause.
Yes, precisely. So Thomas Aquinas famously articulated this by saying, God is ipsum esse subsistens.
Subsistent existence itself.
Right. Subsistent existence itself. What's the nugget to grasp here for you, the listener? Imagine being, or to exist as a verb. For God, that verb is his essence.
Wow.
He doesn't receive existence from somewhere else. He is the act of existing, pure and unadulterated.
Okay.
And this is the ultimate ground of his metaphysical necessity. God cannot fail to exist because what he is existence.
And then diving deeper into this identity thesis,
Yeah.
it posits that God is identical to his attributes.
That's the next step.
So, for example, we have wisdom or goodness, maybe in varying degrees, but the doctrine says God is goodness, he is power, he is wisdom. What's the crucial difference there?
That's it, exactly. These attributes cannot be accidents, non-essential properties added onto the divine substance.
Why not?
Because that would introduce composition into God. If God could gain or lose attributes, or if they were distinct from him, he would be mutable, changing. As Augustine of Hippo brilliantly put it centuries ago, when referring to God, what he has, he is.
What he has, yeah.
Whatever perfection is attributed to God, whether it's power, knowledge, love, or justice, it's not something distinct from him that he possesses. It's identical to his divine nature itself.
Okay, this leads to the most mind-bending part for me, and I think for many listeners, by transitivity. If God is his goodness, and God is his wisdom, then his goodness must be identical to his wisdom.
Yep.
How do we even begin to process that? Because to us, wisdom and goodness feel like very different concepts. What's the key insight here?
That's where we truly hit the limits of human language and conceptualization when talking about the infinite God.
Okay.
From our perspective, from the limited way our minds work, wisdom and goodness are indeed distinct concepts. We understand them through their effects in the world, and we speak of them as separate because our language categorizes discrete qualities.
Right.
The nugget to grasp is this. Imagine a perfect diamond. From one angle, you see its brilliance. From another, its purity. From yet another, its hardness. But it's one indivisible gem.
Ah, good analogy.
God's perfections are like that, a single, unified reality that our finite minds must perceive under different aspects, based on his actions in the world. In God himself, these perfections are not distinct parts or separate qualities. They are one and the same, simple reality.
So the unity in God is absolute.
Yes, even if our language needs to employ multiple terms to describe his singular, infinite being.
Ipsum esse subsistens actus purus.
So all of this culminates in God being understood as actus purus, or ipsum esse subsistens, the sheer act of being subsisting in itself. For you, the listener, what does pure act mean in practical terms beyond the philosophical jargon?
Okay, pure act. It means God has no admixture of potentiality whatsoever.
No potentiality.
None. Let's think about a created thing. A creature is always a mixture of act and potency.
Act and potency. Give me an example.
Right. So a block of marble is marble right now. That's its act. It's actualized as marble. But it also has the potential to become a statue or a countertop or even dust. That's its potency. It can become what it is not yet.
Gotcha.
God, being simple, has no unrealized potential. He isn't waiting to become anything. He is fully and completely everything he can be. He is perfect actuality. He is, in a timeless, complete sense, already actualized in every perfection.
And this idea of pure actuality, it has huge implications for other divine attributes that we often talk about, like immutability.
Absolutely. Because God has no potential for change, no unrealized potency to move from one state to another.
He's immutable?
He is immutable, completely unchangeable. And because he is immutable, not subject to succession of states like time,
He must be eternal.
he is necessarily eternal. He doesn't just endure through infinite time. Rather, he exists outside of time altogether.
Right.
He has no temporal parts, no beginning, middle, or end. And this status, as actus purus, is also the metaphysical ground for his aseity, his absolute self-existence and independence from anything outside of himself.
Wow.
It's all tightly interconnected. The ultimate goal, the creator-creature distinction.
Ultimately, it seems like every facet of divine simplicity serves one crucial purpose.
Which is?
To establish and protect the absolute ontological distinction between the creator and the creature. It's about ensuring God is truly God and not just like a super creature.
That's the cornerstone.
Yeah.
That's absolutely the cornerstone of the entire doctrine. This isn't a distinction of degree, like God is just a really, really big, powerful creature.
Right, not just bigger.
It's a fundamental distinction of kind, a difference in the very mode of being. Creatures are inherently composite, made of parts. They are contingent, meaning they could fail to exist. They are mutable, capable of change. They are temporal, existing within time. And they are dependent, relying on something else for their existence. God, by virtue of his simplicity, is fundamentally the opposite. He is non-composite, necessary, immutable, eternal, and absolutely independent.
So it's like a metaphysical guardrail.
That's a good way to put it.
A theological fence, maybe, to keep us from misunderstanding who God is at his core?
Precisely. It prevents theology from sliding into errors that would compromise this fundamental creator-creature distinction.
Like what kind of errors?
Well, it rules out pantheism, which would identify God with a composite contingent world.
Okay.
It rules out panentheism, which would make God dependent on the world for his full being or expression.
Right.
And it rules out any kind of crude anthropomorphism that would fashion God into a being just like ourselves, only bigger and more powerful.
Got it.
By insisting on simplicity, classical theology asserts that God is not just the greatest being among others. He is being itself, ipsum esse subsistens, the unconditioned reality upon which all composite contingent beings depend for their existence. This means he is utterly unique and transcendent. 2. The deep roots. Historical development of simplicity.
Now, this foundational idea, it didn't just emerge in a vacuum, did it? The report highlights that divine simplicity has an intellectual lineage stretching way back to ancient Greek philosophy, long before Christianity.
Oh yeah, it's a fascinating origin story. The groundwork was very much laid in the Hellenic quest for some kind of unifying principle behind the apparent multiplicity and, chaos of the cosmos.
So they were looking for unity.
Exactly. Thinkers like Parmenides, way back in the 5th century BC, posited a single, unchanging being as the true reality behind all the illusion of change.
Okay.
But it was Plato, with his concept of the form of the good, that really conceived of a supreme principle of unity and perfection, something transcending ordinary being and serving as the ultimate source of reality and intelligibility.
The form of the good.
Yes, this idea of a highest principle that is both supremely unified and perfectly good profoundly shaped later theological reflection.
And Aristotle, one of Plato's most famous students, he built on this with his concept of the unmoved mover.
Yes, exactly. Aristotle conceived of a being of pure actuality, energia, that is simple, immaterial, and unchanging, standing at the apex of a causal hierarchy.
First cause.
Right. This Aristotelian framework, emphasizing a non-composite first cause, provided a powerful metaphysical engine for later monotheistic theologians, both Christian and others.
And the peak of this Greek impulse towards radical simplicity is that Plotinus.
It really is. Plotinus's Neoplatonism, developed in the 3rd century AD, he described the One as this ineffable first principle of all things, a reality so radically simple it transcends all distinctions, even between being and essence.
Wow.
Plotinus argued that any composition in this first principle would imply dependence on its components, which would clearly violate its ultimacy as the ultimate source.
Early church fathers.
So the early Christian thinkers saw these philosophical tools as incredibly useful. They adopted them to articulate the nature of God, especially as they defended monotheism against, the polytheism and fragmented deities of the pagan world.
They absolutely did. The Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lived around the time of the early apostles, had already started this process. He identified the simple first being of Greek philosophy with the God of the Hebrew Bible.
Interesting.
And for the church fathers, simplicity quickly became a crucial polemical weapon in their theological battles.
A weapon, like Athenagoras arguing the Christian God is indivisible, or Irenaeus using it against those Gnostic ideas of divine emanations or parts. That suggested a fragmented deity.
It was incredibly practical for them. Irenaeus, in his battle against Valentinian Gnosticism around the late 2nd century, argued that if God is a simple, uncompounded being, he cannot be divided into parts or have attributes existing separately from him.
Crucial.
This was crucial for safeguarding the unity and integrity of the Godhead. Then, Athanasius of Alexandria, the great champion of Nicene orthodoxy in the 4th century.
Athanasius?
He used it with incredible force against both pagan pantheism and the Arian heresy.
How so?
He argued that a composite God would be unlike himself, just a mere collection of disparate parts, which is contrary to the perfection of God. And against the Arians, who taught that the Son was a created being, Athanasius argued that only the non-composite God and his Word possesses true existence. The Word, the Son, must possess God's simple nature fully to be truly divine.
That makes sense. And then jumping to the West, Augustine of Hippo, often called the Doctor of Grace. He provided the first great systematic articulation of divine simplicity in a Christian framework, didn't he?
He truly did. In works like The City of God and On the Trinity, written in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, Augustine laid foundational principles for the Western tradition.
That famous phrase.
Yes, he famously stated, referring to God, what he has, he is.
Right.
Meaning God's attributes are not accidental properties, but are identical with his essence. For Augustine, simplicity was also absolutely essential for grounding the doctrine of the Trinity in a robust monotheism.
How did it help with the Trinity?
It ensured the three persons didn't represent a division or fragmentation in the divine being. And similarly, Eastern theologians like the Cappadocian Fathers Basil the Great, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, and later figures like John of Damascus, they likewise affirmed God's simplicity as a single, unified act. Knowable under different aspects, but simple in itself.
Anselm and Aquinas.
Okay, so then we get to the High Middle Ages. This is where the doctrine really reached its philosophical and theological zenith, right? Becoming a central pillar of scholastic thought. Who were the absolute key players here?
Without a doubt, Anselm of Canterbury and Thomas Aquinas.
Anselm,
in the 11th century, argued from his famous definition of God as that in which nothing greater could be conceived, that God must be simple.
How did that argument work?
His reasoning was quite elegant. He said, composition implies parts, and anything with parts can be conceived as being divided or dissolving. That suggests an imperfection, or a potential for loss. A supremely perfect being, by definition, cannot be subject to such potential dissolution or imperfection. Therefore, God must be simple.
Makes sense. And, of course, Thomas Aquinas. The report states his work is universally recognized as the historical peak of the doctrine's development. He provided the most systematic defense.
You are absolutely right. Aquinas placed his discussion of divine simplicity right at the very beginning of his treatment of the divine nature in the Summa Theology, Part 1, Question 3 specifically.
Right at the start. That seems intentional.
Highly deliberate and significant. For Aquinas, simplicity is the foundational divine attribute. From it, all others, perfection, infinity, immutability, unity logically derive.
Wow.
He powerfully argued that God, as the unmoved mover and actus purus, cannot have any potentiality. And since all composition involves potentiality, God must be absolutely simple. His rigorous and comprehensive defense became the standard reference point for everyone after him, both defenders and critics.
Dogmatic.
So this wasn't just academics speculating in ivory towers. It eventually became formal dogma for the Roman Catholic Church, enshrined in official councils. What was the impact of that?
It was indeed. The doctrine was formally enshrined at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215.
1215.
Yes. This council explicitly confessed faith in one true God, three persons, but one absolutely simple essence, substance, or nature.
Absolute simple essence.
That decree gave the doctrine an infallible, non-negotiable status within Catholic theology.
And this was reaffirmed centuries later, right?
Okay.
At the First Vatican Council, showing its enduring importance.
Yes, exactly. In 1869-70, the First Vatican Council declared God to be one, living and true, unique, absolutely simple and unchangeable spiritual substance.
Wow.
So for Roman Catholicism, denying divine simplicity isn't just a philosophical disagreement, it's considered a heresy.
Heresy, that's strong.
It cemented its place right at the heart of Western Catholic orthodoxy, making it a cornerstone that must be affirmed. 3. Why believe it? Arguments for simplicity.
Okay. Given all this history, spanning millennia, what are the core arguments supporting divine simplicity? What convinced these great minds? What's the fundamental case for it, for you, the listener?
Well, the most fundamental argument, the one everything else kind of builds on, is rooted in God's aseity.
Aseity, that means self-existence, right?
Exactly. His absolute self-existence and independence. The argument proceeds from the premise that God is the first being, the uncaused cause of all else.
Okay.
If he is truly the ultimate origin, then he cannot be dependent on anything.
And a composite thing, by its very nature, is dependent. It relies on its parts for its existence. Without them, it wouldn't be.
Right.
And it depends on a composer, someone or something that brought those parts together. Like a house needs bricks and a builder.
Exactly. A composite thing is always secondary to its components and its creator.
Makes sense.
God, as ultimate reality, cannot be dependent on anything, either as a constituent part of himself or as an external composer. Aquinas states it clearly, and this is a key quote, "Every composite is posterior to its components and depends upon them. However, God is the first being."
So if God were composite,
Something would be metaphysically prior to him, making him dependent.
which flatly contradicts the definition of God as the uncaused first cause.
Precisely. Simplicity, in this view, is a necessary condition for God's absolute independence. It safeguards his status as the ultimate reality. The argument from perfection, immutability, eternity, and necessity.
Okay, that's the argument from aseity. There's also the argument from God as a maximally perfect being, or as Anselm put it, that than which no greater can be conceived. How does the idea of composition relate to perfection? It feels like complexity might be a perfection sometimes.
That's a great question, because in our world, often complexity is seen as a think of a complex organism or a complex machine.
Right.
But in this classical framework, composition is intrinsically seen as an imperfection. Why?
Because any composite being has an admixture of actuality and potentiality. Its parts, at least in principle, can be rearranged or separated.
Okay.
This implies a potential for dissolution, for ceasing to be what it is, or for change. And potentiality in this context is seen as a mark of imperfection. It suggests a current lack, an incompleteness, maybe a movement towards a more perfect state.
So, a maximally perfect being, it can have no such lack or unrealized potential. It must already be everything it can possibly be.
Therefore, a perfect being cannot be composite. It must be simple or pure act.
Right, actus purus.
And from this conclusion, other critical divine attributes logically flow.
Like what?
First, immutability. Because a simple being has no parts to rearrange, no potential to actualize, no capacity to move from one state to another, it is necessarily unchangeable.
Cannot change.
It cannot become anything other than what it already eternally is. Second, eternity. Change occurs in time. Temporality is the measure of succession and change.
But God doesn't change. A being that is absolutely immutable, not subject to any change, must therefore exist outside of time altogether. God doesn't merely endure through infinite moments. He transcends time as its creator.
Okay. Immutability, eternity.
Yes.
What else?
And third, necessity. The tightest possible connection between a thing's nature and its existence is identity.
Which simplicity provides.
Exactly. In a simple being, as we discussed, essence and existence are one. Such a being cannot not exist. Its non-existence is a metaphysical impossibility. Simplicity is the ground of God's metaphysical necessity. He exists not by chance or by receiving existence, but because he is existence. The argument from Scripture, exegetical and systematic inferences.
Even though the precise term simplicity isn't found directly in the Bible, proponents argue it's a necessary consequence of what Scripture does reveal about God's nature. So it's more of an inference, then, drawn from various scriptural themes.
Yes, that's crucial. This isn't usually presented as a single proof text argument, but rather a systematic inference drawn from multiple biblical data points.
Like the Shema.
Exactly. The foundational confession of Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, Deuteronomy 6.4, is often interpreted by classical theologians as pointing beyond mere monotheism to God's unique, indivisible perfection, his absolute oneness in being. Stephen Charnock, a 17th century Puritan, argued this clearly. Because God is one, he must be free from any multitude or composition.
So when the Apostle John says God is light in 1 John 1.5 and God is love in 1 John 4.8, this is taken to mean God is these perfections, not just that he possesses them as qualities that could be distinct from him.
Exactly. Those are seen as strong affirmations of the identity thesis.
And John's emphatic addition, in him is no darkness at all, reinforces that pure, uncompounded nature free from any mixture or division.
Precisely. Plus, you have scripture teaching that God is spirit, John 4.24, implying he is incorporeal, therefore without physical parts.
Right.
And it repeatedly affirms his immutability. I, the Lord, do not change, from Malachi 3.6 or James 1.17, which describes God as the Father of lights with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow.
Okay. And as we discussed earlier, immutability is best explained by a lack of composition. So divine simplicity is seen as the doctrine that coherently unites these various scriptural affirmations into a single, consistent, and logically robust doctrine of God, the Trinitarian imperative. How simplicity grounds monotheism. Now, within Christian theology, one of the most powerful and frankly fascinating arguments for simplicity is its role in preserving monotheism while simultaneously affirming the doctrine of the Trinity.
Ah, yes.
This seems like a monumental paradox at first glance.
Yeah.
How can God be absolutely simple, yet three?
This is indeed a crucial tension, and it's where the doctrine of simplicity really shows its theological utility for its proponents. How can God be absolutely one and without composition, yet simultaneously exist as three distinct persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, each of whom is fully God?
It looks like a contradiction.
It appears so. The classical theological solution doesn't deny the distinction of persons, but it carefully defines the nature of that distinction. It says simplicity denies compositional distinctions. God isn't made of parts, but it doesn't rule out all distinctions.
Okay, so the key is what kind of distinction we're talking about. Can you break that down for us?
Precisely. The key insight is that the distinction between the divine persons is not absolute but relative. They are distinguished solely by their relations of origin to one another.
Relations of origin.
Yeah. Think of it like this. The Father is distinguished by paternity. He is unbegotten and eternally begets the Son.
Okay.
The Son is distinguished by filiation. He is eternally begotten of the Father.
Yeah.
And the Holy Spirit is distinguished by spiration. He eternally proceeds from the Father, and in the Western tradition, also from the Son.
And these relations, paternity, filiation, spiration, they aren't accidents added to the divine essence, right? That would violate simplicity.
No, exactly. They're not distinct qualities God possesses that could somehow be separated.
So what are they?
They're what are called subsistent relations.
Subsistent relations.
This means the relations themselves are the persons, and the persons are the one divine essence subsisting in a relational mode. The Father is the divine essence as paternally related. The Son is the divine essence as filially related.
Wow, okay.
Because the distinction lies only in these mutually defining relations, the absolute unity of the simple divine essence is preserved.
So simplicity actually makes the Trinity possible within monotheism.
In this view, yes. It's actually the essential safeguard for the Trinity. It prevents the theological slide into tritheism, three separate gods, or partialism, where each person is only a part of God.
Right.
It ensures that when we say each person is fully God, they are fully the one undivided essence. 4. The crucible of critique. Major objections to divine simplicity.
Okay, we've built a strong case for why classical theology insists on God's simplicity. We've traced its history and logic. But as with any profound idea, it's not all smooth sailing.
Definitely not.
Some of the most powerful minds of modern philosophy have directly challenged it. Let's step into the crucible of critique, starting with what's often called the Plantinga problem. What's that all about?
All right. Alvin Plantinga, a hugely influential analytic philosopher, he launched a powerful argument against the identity thesis at the heart of divine simplicity. This was in his 1980 book, Does God Have a Nature?
Okay.
He claims that DDS asserts God is identical with each of his properties. So God is identical with his power, God is identical with his goodness.
Right, the identity thesis.
Then, by the logical principle of transitivity of identity, if A, B, and A, C, then B, C. So if God is power and God, spirit, or goodness, then power, goodness. This, Plantinga argues, implies that God has only one property.
Only one property.
Yeah, which he deems flatly incompatible with the obvious fact that God has several properties, like wisdom, justice, love, that they seem distinct.
And then he takes that a step further, arguing that if God is identical with his properties, and properties are abstract objects like numbers or redness, then God himself must be an abstract object. My brain is starting to hurt a little here.
Yeah, that's his next very crucial step. He argues this makes God a self-exemplifying property, a property that exemplifies itself.
Okay.
And this leads directly to what he calls the obvious and overwhelming difficulty. Abstract objects like redness or the number 5 are causally inert. They can't act, they can't know, they can't love, and they certainly cannot create anything.
So his conclusion is pretty stark then, if DDS is true.
Then, in Plantinga's words, God isn't a person, but a mere abstract object. He has no knowledge, awareness, power, love, or life.
Wow. That fundamentally contradicts the most basic affirmations of theism, that God is a living, active, personal being.
Exactly. Plantinga concludes that DDS is an utter mistake. Now, this objection really rests on a specific metaphysical framework he operates within, often called a non-constituent ontology, where individuals, concrete particulars, and properties, abstract universals, belong to radically disjoint realms. From this viewpoint, the central claims of DDS appear to be not just false, but category mistakes, like saying the number 3 is angry, the threat of modal collapse, divine freedom and creation.
Okay, that's a big one. Another severe objection, and one that causes a lot of theological angst, is that divine simplicity leads to modal collapse.
A modal collapse.
Where everything, even creation itself, becomes absolutely necessary rather than a free choice. How does that argument unfold?
This critique, powerfully advanced by contemporary philosophers like R.T. Mullins, directly challenges simplicity's compatibility with divine freedom. The argument goes something like this. God exists by absolute necessity. He cannot not exist, right?
Right, we established that.
Okay. According to DDS, there are no real distinctions in God. All his actions are identical to each other, forming a single, eternal, divine act.
Right, because he's simple and immutable.
And this one singular divine act is identical to God's essence, which, as we established, is identical to his necessary existence.
Okay, following the logic.
Correct. Therefore, if the act of creation is identical to God's essence and necessary existence, then God's act, including the act of creating the world, must be as necessary as his own existence.
Oh.
Which leads to the conclusion that God was not free to refrain from creating. The universe exists necessarily and could not have been otherwise. It wasn't a free, gracious act, but an inevitable one.
This directly seems to contradict the traditional understanding of God as a free creator who chose to create out of love and grace, not out of some inherent necessity. And it potentially undermines human free will, too, if everything is necessary. This is a huge problem, isn't it?
It is indeed. It's a significant challenge. Now, defenders of DDS attempt to counter this.
How?
They distinguish between God's necessary internal act, ad intra, which is his essence, and includes his decision to create, and its contingent external effects, ad extra, which are the actual created things.
So the decision is necessary, but the result isn't.
Sort of. They argue that the necessity of God's being doesn't translate into a necessity for his creative effects. However, critics often view this distinction as an ad hoc maneuver, something created just to solve the problem, that doesn't fully resolve the logical entailment of modal collapse they see flowing from DDS, the personal nature of God, reconciling simplicity with a relational deity.
A broader and I think very understandable objection questions the very personal nature of God under divine simplicity.
Yeah.
How can a God who is simple, immutable, timeless, and impassible, meaning unaffected by external forces, be a person in any way we understand or relate to? It feels like we're losing the God of the Bible here.
This is a powerful point of contention, and maybe the most intuitively felt one for many people, as David Hume famously argued centuries ago.
Yeah.
A mind, as we understand it, involves a succession of distinct thoughts, feelings, and volitions. This implies composition, different mental states, and change moving from one thought to another. A being that is a single, simple, unchanging act, Hume concluded, has no thought, no reason, no will, no sentiment, no love, no hatred, or in a word, is no mind at all.
Ouch. That has significant theological weight for believers. How can an unchanging God existing outside of time enter into genuine, reciprocal relationships with us, who are constantly changing within time?
Exactly.
It seems to portray God as static, remote, unrelatable. A far cry from the personal, covenant-making God of the Bible who walks with Adam, who grieves over sin and rejoices over the repentant. The classical conception seems to make him distant and unapproachable.
Exactly. The challenge is profound. How do you reconcile a metaphysically perfect, absolutely simple God with a living, acting, personal God revealed in Scripture? This isn't just an abstract philosophical problem. It impacts how believers perceive and relate to God in their daily lives. The liturgical objection. Does simplicity render divine action metaphorical?
And philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff extends this critique of DDS specifically to the realm of worship and liturgy. He argues that the doctrine creates bafflements for the ordinary believer, making daily religious practice difficult.
How so? He hits on a critical point for the average person of faith. When we pray, when we offer petitions, or when we engage in worship, we intuitively presuppose a God who genuinely hears our prayers, responds to us, and acts in history. But if God is absolutely simple and immutable, then all such language, God hearing, God responding, God acting, appears to be purely metaphorical.
Metaphorical.
Yeah, God doesn't hear in a new way because there's no new thought or state in him. And his response isn't a new action on his part, since all his action is one eternal, unchanging act.
So what's the classical response to that? Because people do pray and believe God hears.
The classical response often involves what are called Cambridge properties or extrinsic relations. The argument is that the change isn't in God, but in the creature. For example, when you pray, the change is in you having prayed, or in the world being changed by your prayer, not in God acquiring a new property of having heard your prayer.
So God doesn't change. The relationship to God changes.
Something like that. God's relation to the world is described as logical or conceptual, while the world's relation to God is real. For critics like Wolterstorff, this is a philosophically contrived solution. He argues it evacuates the language of faith of its plain and intended meaning. It makes divine interaction seem illusory or merely a linguistic convenience rather than a genuine dynamic exchange.
Yeah, I can see that.
This directly challenges the lived relational experience that is often at the heart of Christian piety and worship. It presents a deep chasm between abstract theological precision and the everyday experience of faith, the simplicity and the mysteries of faith, Trinity and incarnation.
Okay, so divine simplicity faces its most acute challenges, it seems, when brought into contact with central Christian mysteries, like the Trinity and the incarnation.
Absolutely. This is where the tension is highest.
The Trinity seems to explicitly posit complexity, three distinct persons, while simplicity denies it. How do classical theologians even begin to reconcile this apparent contradiction?
It's a crucial tension, as you say. How can God be absolutely one and without composition, yet simultaneously exist as three distinct persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, each of whom is fully God?
It looks impossible on the surface.
The classical solution, again, doesn't deny the distinction of persons, but carefully defines its nature. Simplicity denies compositional distinctions. God isn't made of parts, but it doesn't rule out all distinctions.
Okay, so remind us, what kind of distinction are we talking about here? Give us a clear way to understand these nuanced differences.
Right. The key insight, as we touched on before, is that the distinction between the divine persons is not absolute, but relative. They are distinguished solely by their relations of origin to one another.
Relations again.
Yes. Think of it again. The Father is distinguished by paternity. He is unbegotten, eternally begets the Son. The Son by filiation, eternally begotten of the Father. The Holy Spirit by spiration, eternally proceeds from the Father and Son in the West.
And these relations, paternity, filiation, spiration, they aren't accidents added to the divine essence, which would violate simplicity.
No, they are not distinct qualities God possesses that could be separated from him.
So they are.
They are subsistent relations. The relations themselves are the persons, and the persons are the one divine essence subsisting in a relational mode.
The essence subsisting relationally.
Exactly. The Father is the divine essence as paternally related. The Son is the divine essence as filially related. Because the distinction lies only in these mutually defining relations, the absolute unity of the simple divine essence is preserved.
So simplicity, in this view, is the essential safeguard for the Trinity.
Yes, preventing tritheism, three gods, or partialism, each person is a part of God. It ensures that when Christians say each person is fully God, they mean fully the one undivided essence.
Can the immutable God enter into history?
Right, then there's the incarnation, the Son of God taking on a human nature in Jesus Christ. This also seems to involve profound change in God, which directly contradicts divine immutability, a key consequence of simplicity.
Another profound mystery.
How is this reconciled? It seems like God would have to change in a fundamental way to become human.
This is another place where divine simplicity helps articulate the mystery without falling into contradiction, at least in the classical view. The Orthodox solution, famously codified at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD,
Chalcedon
relies on a careful distinction between person and nature. Jesus Christ is affirmed as one person with two distinct natures, divine and human, united, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation.
Without confusion, without change. So the key here is that the change isn't in the divine nature itself. That feels like the critical point.
Exactly. The change occurs not in the divine nature, which remains simple and immutable, but in the created human nature that is assumed by the divine person.
Assumed by the person.
Yes. The person of the Son, who is eternal and immutable, does not change in his divine being. The divine nature, which is simple and immutable, does not change. What happens is that the eternal person of the Son begins to subsist in a new way. By uniting a complete human nature with a human body and a human soul to himself.
So the change is entirely on the side of the creature. A new creation happens, not a change in God. This is quite a subtle distinction.
Yes, the change is entirely on the side of the creature. A human nature that did not exist before comes into being, and is assumed by the divine person of the Son.
Okay.
This allows for the communicatio idiomatum, the communication of properties.
Communication of properties.
Like the properties of each nature can be truly predicated of the one person of Christ. So we can truthfully say God was born of the Virgin Mary or God died on the cross.
What does that mean?
It means the person who is God was born and died according to his human nature. The divine nature itself remains simple, immutable, and impassible, untouched by change or suffering.
Okay, I think I get it.
These intricate distinctions are, for classical theologians, the necessary intellectual tools. They hold together the revealed data of Scripture with the philosophical requirements of a transcendent creator. Simplicity forces this precision, ensuring the incarnation is understood as God becoming man without God ceasing to be God or undergoing a change in his essential being. 6. Different perspectives. Simplicity in Christian traditions.
No, it sounds like this doctrine of simplicity isn't uniformly understood. Even across different Christian traditions, there seem to be significant variations in how it's articulated.
You're absolutely right. While many Christian traditions affirm some form of simplicity, its specific formulation and the philosophical tools used to defend it have varied significantly.
Let's start with the dominant one in the West.
Okay, so Thomas Aquinas' formulation, often called the strong or classical version, is dominant in Roman Catholic thought and widely influential. Its key features are a real identity between God's essence, his existence, and all his attributes. They're ontologically one and the same reality.
But we still talk about God's mercy and justice as distinct attributes, right? How does that work if they're all ontologically one? That's hard to hold in my mind.
That's where Aquinas introduces what he called conceptual distinction, or distinctio rationis.
Conceptual distinction.
The distinctions we make between, say, God's mercy and his justice are purely conceptual, existing in the human mind. Now, they aren't arbitrary fictions. They are grounded in the reality of God.
Okay.
As our finite minds must grasp his infinite perfection through multiple distinct effects he produces in creation. When God acts to forgive, we conceive of him as merciful. When he acts to uphold righteousness, we conceive of him as just. But in God himself, these are not separate realities.
And because of this absolute ontological gap between the simple creator and composite creatures, Aquinas insists language about God must be analogical.
Yes, exactly. Not univocal. When we say God is good and Socrates is good, good isn't used in exactly the same sense univocally or completely different senses, equivocally.
It's analogous.
It's analogous. Socrates' goodness is a finite, created participation in the goodness. God is infinitely and essentially. The Scotist alternative.
Yeah.
Univocity and the formal distinction.
Okay, that's Aquinas. But a different approach comes from John Duns Scotus. He offered an alternative while still defending divine simplicity. What was his major innovation?
Indeed. Scotus, a Franciscan theologian from the late 13th and early 14th centuries, he famously argued for univocal predication for some concepts.
Univocal, so the same meaning.
Yes, especially for what he called pure perfections, attributes like good, wise, being. He believed that for human reason to have any certain and objective knowledge of God, concepts like good or wise must be applied with the same fundamental meaning to both God and creatures, even if infinitely more perfectly in God.
So he disagreed with Aquinas on analogy there.
On the extent of it, yes. Without this univocity, he thought our language about God would be too ambiguous.
Okay. And to account for a plurality of attributes in God without compromising simplicity, he introduced the famous formal distinction. Can you help us wrap our heads around that? It sounds complex.
Yes, the distinctio formalis a parte re. It's a crucial innovation. You could think of it as a middle ground between a real distinction, which would imply separability in composition,
Right.
and a merely conceptual distinction, which exists only in our minds, like in Aquinas' view.
Okay, a middle ground.
For Scotus, the distinction between God's wisdom and his goodness isn't just in our minds. There's a non-identity in reality, a distinct formality or reality for each attribute that grounds our distinct concepts, even though these formalities are inseparable and exist within the simple divine essence. This allowed Scotus to affirm objective distinctions among the attributes themselves prior to human thought, while still maintaining God's absolute simplicity. So it's a distinction that's not quite real, but not merely in our heads.
That is subtle. The Eastern Orthodox model, the essence-energies distinction. Now, this next one feels like a radical departure from both Western models. I'm thinking of St. Gregory Palamas and the Eastern Orthodox tradition with its essence-energies distinction. How does that approach divine simplicity?
Indeed, it is quite different. Palamism, as articulated by St. Gregory Palamas in the 14th century, posits a real distinction in God.
A real distinction, doesn't that violate simplicity?
Well, they argue it doesn't constitute composition. It's a real distinction between his utterly transcendent and unknowable essence, ougia, and his uncreated but communicable energies.
Essence and energies. What are the energies?
The energies are understood as God himself in his self-manifestation and action in the world. Things like divine love, divine grace, and the uncreated light of Mount Tabor experienced during Christ's transfiguration.
So it allows God to remain absolutely simple and incomprehensible in his essence, but genuinely interact with the world and be experienced by humans through his energies. This seems like it aims to solve that remoteness problem we discussed earlier.
Exactly. This distinction is the cornerstone of Orthodox soteriology and spirituality. It allows humans to achieve theosis deification or divinization, or real union with God, by participating in these uncreated energies without ever comprehending or becoming part of the divine essence itself. Now, Western theologians have historically criticized this.
How so?
They often see it as a violation of divine simplicity by introducing composition into God, arguing that a real distinction implies separability or parts.
But the Orthodox counter that the energies aren't parts but are the very mode of his existence ad extra, his way of being present and active.
Yes, exactly. They argue that without this distinction, you risk either pantheism, where God's essence gets directly involved and mingled with the composite world, or deism, portraying God as a remote, unknowable monad with no real connection to creation.
So it's their unique solution.
It's their unique solution to safeguard both God's transcendence and his immanence without, in their view, compromising his essential simplicity, the Protestant inheritance. From consensus to controversy.
What about Protestantism? It seems their relationship with divine simplicity has shifted quite a bit over time. Was it always a core doctrine for them?
That's a keen observation. Historically, the early Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, and certainly the later Protestant scholastics of the 16th and 17th centuries, largely affirmed classical divine simplicity.
They did.
Oh, yes. It was seen as essential for God's aseity, immutability, and perfection. It's codified in major Protestant confessional documents.
Like which ones?
The Lutheran Augsburg Confession from 1530 states, God is without body, without parts. And the Reformed Westminster Confession of Faith from 1646 declares God to be a most pure spirit, invisible, without body, parts, or passions.
So there was a broad confessional consensus across early Protestantism.
There really was.
But in the 20th century, it really came under heavy fire within Protestantism, especially in evangelical circles. What changed?
Yes, that's precisely when the shift accelerated. With the rise of analytic philosophy of religion, influential thinkers like Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig led the charge.
Plantinga again.
Yes. Rejecting the doctrine as philosophically incoherent and, in their view, biblically unwarranted. Their critiques, which we touched on earlier, have become pretty mainstream in many evangelical circles.
Leading
to a widespread abandonment of the classical view in favor of what's often called theistic personalism.
Theistic personalism.
Which views God more as a supreme being who has distinct, though essential properties, rather than being identical to his properties. It's a different conception of God's nature.
Yet there's a contemporary movement now trying to retrieve classical theism, including divine simplicity. It seems the debate is far from over.
You're right. This classical theism retrieval movement, championed by scholars like James Dolezal, Matthew Barrett, and Carl Trueman, argues for a return to the historic confessional understanding of God.
What's their argument?
They contend that rejecting simplicity undermines the entire classical doctrine of God, potentially leading to a conception of God that is more creature-like, less truly transcendent, and maybe even places modern evangelicalism closer to heterodox positions historically. So the discussion is very much alive and impactful today. 7. Simplicity in dialogue, a comparative look at Islamic tawhid.
It's fascinating how similar intellectual pressures and theological questions appear in other monotheistic traditions, not just Christianity. Let's look briefly at Islam.
Yes, what's particularly striking here is the parallel in Islamic theology, centered on the concept of tawhid. This is the absolute non-negotiable principle of Islam. It means the absolute oneness, uniqueness, and indivisibility of God, or Allah. It's the central message of the Quran and the very first pillar of the faith, encapsulated in the testimony, there is no God but God.
So it's more than just simple monotheism. It's a comprehensive assertion of God's singularity, denying any partners, any composition, any likeness to created beings, much like simplicity.
Absolutely. The Quran emphasizes that God is a thing unlike other things. That's Quran 42.01, and that nothing is like him. Quran 112.4. In its philosophical implications, Tawhid functions remarkably similarly to divine simplicity. It posits a God who is not limited, finite, or composite, but is pure actuality and the ultimate reality encompassing all others. It's fundamentally about the absolute indivisible unity of God's being.
Notzalite and Asherite views on divine attributes.
And just like in Christianity, there were intense internal debates in Islam on how to reconcile God's absolute oneness with his various attributes mentioned in the Quran, like his knowledge, power, or mercy.
Precisely. It seems these profound questions aren't unique to one faith tradition. Islamic theology, known as Kalam, was shaped by a major controversy over the nature of the divine attributes.
What were the main schools of thought?
Well, the Mu'tazili school, a highly rationalist stream in early Islam, championed a very strong doctrine of divine simplicity. It closely mirrored the Thomistic identity thesis we discussed.
Really? How so?
They argued that affirming real, distinct attributes would compromise Tawhid by creating a plurality of eternal entities alongside God. For them, God is knowing by his very essence, not through a distinct attribute of knowledge that inheres in him. The attributes are identical to the divine essence.
Okay, very strong simplicity. And the Ash'ari school, which became the dominant Sunni theological school, they took a different approach, maybe more like Scotist.
Perhaps. The Ash'ari school, aiming to be more faithful to the literal sense of the Quran, affirmed that God possesses real, eternal attributes like knowledge, power, will, life, hearing, sight, speech, that are distinct from his essence.
Distinct from his essence.
Yeah.
How do they maintain Tawhid then?
Right. To safeguard Tawhid, they used a paradoxical formula. They said the attributes are not identical to God and not other than him. Not
identical, not other.
That's tricky. It is. It means these attributes subsist in the divine essence and are inseparable from it, but they are not the essence itself. Now, this position was fiercely criticized by the Mu'tazila for introducing multiplicity into God. Some critics even claimed it resembled the Christian doctrine of the Trinity.
Interesting.
Later, Islamic philosophers like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and mystical thinkers like Ibn Arabi generally favored a stricter interpretation of simplicity, more like the Mu'tazila, often interpreting the attributes as negations of imperfection or as mere relations to creation, points of convergence and divergence.
So what really stands out to you when comparing Christian divine simplicity and Islamic Tawhid? Where do they converge and where do they fundamentally diverge? What are the biggest takeaways from this comparison?
The convergence is strikingly clear. Both classical Christian theology and the main schools of Islamic thought are deeply committed to the concept of a simple, transcendent, non-composite God. They both employ remarkably similar philosophical arguments, largely derived from a shared Neoplatonic and Aristotelian heritage arguments from God as the first cause, arguments from perfection against composition.
Right.
Both traditions grapple with the same fundamental intellectual problem. How do you reconcile the absolute unity and simplicity of the divine essence with the plurality of attributes or names revealed in their respective scriptures?
And the internal debates show different strategies.
Exactly. Thomas versus Scotist in Christianity, Mu'tazilite versus Asherite in Islam. They represent different strategies for resolving this core tension while upholding divine unity.
But the ultimate and irreconcilable point of divergence, that has to be Christianity's doctrine of the Trinity.
Yeah.
That's the one hurdle Islamic theology cannot accept.
Exactly. While Islamic theology struggles with how to conceive of a plurality of attributes without compromising Tawhid, Christian theology must account for a plurality of persons within the one simple God. From an Islamic perspective, the Trinity is seen as the quintessential violation of Tawhid. It appears to introduce composition and multiplicity at the highest level of the Godhead.
But from a Christian perspective?
From a Christian perspective, however, divine simplicity is what makes the doctrine of the Trinity coherent as a form of monotheism. It is the indivisible simplicity of the divine essence that ensures the three persons are one God, not three separate gods. It's the foundation allowing distinct persons without dividing the divine being.
So the same philosophical tool leads to radically different, even opposing theological conclusions.
Precisely. regarding the ultimate nature of the divine, the contemporary battleground and concluding analysis.
Okay, this clearly isn't just a historical curiosity. The doctrine of divine simplicity remains a vibrant and contentious topic today. It touches on the very nature of God and the viability of our theological language. For you, the listener, what are the stakes of this debate? Why should we care?
The stakes are profoundly high. Proponents of classical divine simplicity argue that to abandon this doctrine is to unravel the entire fabric of classical theism.
The whole thing.
Well, attributes like God's aseity, his self-existence, his immutability, his eternity, his absolute perfection, they're all seen as logical and necessary entailments of his non-composition. If God isn't simple, then he is dependent on parts. And if he is dependent, he isn't truly God in the classical sense.
The report even mentions David Bentley Hart, who makes the really provocative claim that a denial of divine simplicity is tantamount to atheism. That's quite a statement.
It is provocative, but it's not just an emotional outburst. It's a conclusion rooted in a profound metaphysical logic.
Explain that logic.
The argument is that God, in its classical sense, refers to the ultimate, unconditioned, necessary ground of all contingent reality. A being that is composite is, by definition, conditioned and contingent. It depends on its parts and on a cause to unite those parts. Such a being is not the creator, but is itself a creature, merely one finite object among others, however great. So to posit a God, who is not simple, is to posit a being that fails to meet the metaphysical requirements for being God.
Leaving you with
A universe of contingent things with no ultimate unconditioned explanation, which is, functionally, a form of atheism, or at least a radical redefinition of God away from the classical understanding.
But critics argue that affirming DDS can lead to its own form of practical atheism because such a God becomes an irrelevant philosophical abstraction too distant to worship. It's a trade-off, they'd say.
Yes, this is the flip side of the coin. And it's where the rubber meets the road for many believers. A God who is a static, immutable, single act without distinct properties or the ability to enter into genuine reciprocal relationships seems so far removed from the living, personal God of the Bible who acts in history and loves his creation. Critics argue that such a God becomes an irrelevant philosophical abstraction, difficult to relate to or worship.
So the choice seems to be between what? A God who is metaphysically coherent but religiously unavailable, and a God who is religiously available but maybe metaphysically incoherent or overly creature-like.
That's a good way to frame the fundamental dilemma at the heart of modern debate, the neoclassical theist defense, responding to modern objections.
So how do contemporary defenders of divine simplicity, the neoclassical theists, respond to these powerful critiques from Plantinga, Mullins, Wolterstorff, and others? It feels like they have a lot of ground to cover.
They've mounted a robust defense. Often they argue that modern objections improperly apply creaturely categories to God through a univocal use of language.
Applying human concepts directly to God.
Exactly. For example, when critics say a simple being can't be personal, they assume God's personhood must operate like humans, involving distinct thoughts and successive states. Classical theists respond that God's personhood exists in a sui generis, simple mode that utterly transcends our creaturely experience.
So the language is analogical again.
Yes, the language we use about God's personhood is therefore analogical, not identical in meaning, to human personhood.
And what about the modal collapse argument? That everything created must be necessary. That still feels like a massive hurdle.
For that, defenders insist on that crucial distinction between God's necessary inner life, ad intra, his eternal essence in internal Trinitarian relations, and his contingent external acts, ad extra, his act of creating the world.
Right, the internal versus external.
They argue that the necessity of God's being an internal act doesn't logically translate into a necessity for his creative effects. The link is one of free will, not logical entailment. God freely chooses to create, even though his act of willing is eternal and identical to his essence.
Ultimately, it sounds like many defenders adopt a kind of Mysterian stance regarding these apparent contradictions, almost saying it's beyond us.
Yes, that's a common approach, you could say. They acknowledge that the finite human mind, accustomed as we are to composite spatio-temporal reality, simply cannot fully grasp how a simple being can be both metaphysically necessary and supremely free.
Or one and three.
Or how God can be utterly one, yet three distinct persons. The apparent contradictions, they argue, reflect the inherent limits of our intellect and language when faced with the transcendent, infinite reality of God. rather than a genuine incoherence in God himself.
So it's a mystery.
It's a profound mystery that our finite minds are simply not equipped to fully comprehend. Synthesis and avenues for further reflection.
This deep dive has really revealed a fundamental choice, hasn't it? For theologians, and for anyone contemplating the nature of God, do we lean into a God who is radically transcendent in being itself, utterly simple and unconditioned, or a God who is the supreme personal agent, perhaps more relatable but existing with distinct essential properties that might make him more akin to a creature?
And progress in this debate truly requires engaging with the underlying metaphysical presuppositions that inform each side.
Right.
Some key questions for further reflection for you, the listener, might include: can defenders of divine simplicity articulate a constituent ontology? Maybe, that is coherent and persuasive to modern analytic philosophers, bridging that gap with critics like Plantinga.
There's the big ask.
Could the Eastern Orthodox essence-energies distinction offer a robust third way, maybe one that bridges absolute divine transcendence with genuine divine interaction in a way that Western models sometimes struggle to do?
Interesting possibility.
And perhaps most importantly, what are the ultimate pastoral, liturgical, and ethical implications of adopting one view over the other? How does your conception of God shape your daily life and worship? Outro.
Wow, what a journey. From the ancient Greeks to medieval scholastics, right up to modern analytic philosophy. The concept of divine simplicity forces us to confront the very limits of our language and understanding when contemplating the divine. It's truly a profound puzzle.
It truly is. And far from being, some obsolete relic of medieval thought, the doctrine remains a critical and live issue today. It compels theologians to articulate a vision of God that is at once philosophically sound, biblically faithful, and spiritually viable.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think deeply about what it really means for God to be God, the unconditioned ground of all reality.
And for you, the listener, we hope this deep dive provides not just knowledge, but maybe a deeper appreciation for the profound intellectual tradition behind concepts you might encounter in religious or philosophical discussions. What does it mean for you that God might be utterly simple? How might that shape your own understanding of his nature, his actions, and your relationship with him? It's a thought that truly builds on everything we've explored today.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something to continue wrestling with long after this deep dive ends.
Something to mull over indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.